everyone to today's webinar. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wongal people of the Gadigal Nation, where I am, but I realise we're sitting on the lands of many First Nations. And First Nations people have cared for this land over thousands of years, and we have much to learn from their practices that relate to justice, law and living on this land. I recognise that in Australia, sovereignty was never ceded, and we have a collective responsibility to resist and relinquish power to recast relations, including in the justice system. Today we have an unbelievable lineup of presenters from Canada and the United States with long-standing experience in calling to account the justice system and working towards change in prisons and releasing people from prisons. We will be reflecting on the experience of correction systems, primarily jails, in responding to the coronavirus pandemic. So the topic today is COVID-19 and North American corrections, learnings for Australia. So on first flush, this might appear ironic, given that there have been tragic numbers of COVID cases and deaths in North American prisons. In the US, the rates of infection have been 5 times the general population, and the rate of deaths has been 3 times higher. In fact, 89 of the top 100 COVID clusters in the United States were prisons. In Canada in May, the rate of infection in prisons was 13 times higher than in the general population. However, the pandemic has also been a moment in which activists and advocates for people in prison have been mobilised. In North America, this mobilisation has led to opportunities to reframe the debate, including in relation to measures to safeguard health of the people inside, release people, and abolish prisons. This advocacy, which has long existed in sections of the North American community, as well as in Australia through the struggles of organisations such as Sisters Inside and Flat Out, has been amplified at this time. It's coincided with growing movements for Black Lives Matter in many parts of the world. The Black Lives Matter movements and campaigns against First Nations deaths in custody in Australia have highlighted that it doesn't take a pandemic to kill Black people in prisons or on the streets at the hands of police. This is operationalised in the systemic racism of the criminal justice system. It follows that with COVID, almost half of the people in US prisons who have died have been African Americans. This is a continuation of the racist violence in prisons. So while Australia has not had the same outbreaks in prisons, and I think this is very much a reflection of the lower rates in society at large of COVID-19 up until now, there have nonetheless been horrific restrictions imposed on men, women and children inside Australian prisons. These include segregation at much higher rates, lockdowns and prohibitions on personal visits and programs. This has compromised the well-being of people inside. So in the same way that the pandemic has crossed the borders, so have the state's responses to the prison environment. Universally, the correction system has become a highly punitive system. There have, however, been alternative responses, such as releasing people from prison, which have been pioneered not only by the state, but by movements of activists who have called for this change. To introduce myself, I'm Thalia Anthony and a Professor of Law at UTS, the University of Technology, Sydney. Probably more definingly, I'm an activist and a radical, you could say. Since the pandemic, I've worked with lawyers, academics, the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Legal Services, NATSLs, and other community legal services and community organisations to prepare 3 open letters for the safe release of people from prisons, as well as improvements to the prison conditions and oversight improvements. We've not had the systematic release of people in Australian prisons. However, prison numbers have been falling. mainly due to reductions of the number of people on remand because courts are more willing to prioritise the health conditions of people inside or the health factors. Nonetheless, prison conditions in Australia remain oppressive and have unprecedented restrictions. Just some housekeeping. We're going to field questions at the end of each session. So please put your questions in the Q&A Zoom function. We'll hear first from the Canadian speakers, then there'll be questions followed by a break. And after the break, we'll hear from our US colleagues and have further Q&A before closing. So I'll introduce each speaker individually as we go. And I'll ask Stephen Caruana, who's the organiser of this event and a steadfast advocate for the rights and safety of people inside and the release of people from prisons, to include relevant links in the uploaded YouTube recording, including links to the open letters that I mentioned. So without further ado, our first speaker is Ivan Zinger, an adjunct professor with the Law Department at Carleton University. Dr. Zinger is the Correctional Investigator of Canada. He has made a substantial academic contribution, including through his publications on prison oversight, correctional treatment, conditional release, penal segregation, and the impact of tough on crime measures on corrections. He recently launched the Expert Network on External Prison Oversight and Human Rights under the governance of the International Corrections and Prisons Association. The mission of the network is to share information, best practices, and lessons learned on effective external prison oversight to enhance openness, transparency, and accountability of prison authorities. He is the recipient of the 2014 Apex Partnership Award for making communities safer by building strong and effective partnerships across the country and abroad, contributing to the development of more effective correctional practices in Canada. I know we can't offer an applause, but please accept my warm welcome, and we look forward to hearing your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Talia, for all these kind words, and thank you, Stephen, for organizing this, because I know these things are logistically challenging. So I'm very happy to take part in this. I'm not quite sure why I won the lottery and I'm the first one to speak, but anyhow, we'll go on. I enjoy, Talia, your sort of overview, and one thing that you talked about was the title of this session, something about learning for Australia. And I think like when you learn from any other jurisdiction or anything in life, you can learn two ways. You learn from from what to do in terms of successes, or what not to do, failure. And I think for Canada, there's a bit of both, and it's certainly at the federal level. And what I think I'll do is I'll go quickly. I've got a timer, so I will try to stay on to my 15 minutes. What I'll do is I'll first go briefly to give you a sort of a brief overview of Canadian corrections. And then just briefly go over the mandate of my office and how COVID has changed that mandate somehow. And then certainly go over what happened in federal corrections, and then maybe talk a little bit about some of the recommendations that my office has made and how some have been accepted and some have been rejected. So if I go and I have a look at the deck, I'm assuming Stephen will post the presentation. There we go. So in terms of slides number 2, in terms of Canadian correction, it's Canada is a confederation. There are provinces and federal, and both actually run prisons and penitentiaries. So for in terms of what federal is responsible for is for sentences of 2 years or more. and people are sentenced to penitentiaries. If it's 2 years or less, they go to provincial jails and prisons. So I will focus primarily on federal because that's my area, my jurisdiction. Correction is, of course, big business. We're looking at the federal level. We spend in Canada about $120,000 per inmate per year. And for about 4 or 5 years, the prison population was about the same, around 14,000 inmates in federal corrections. And for provincial custody, it hover around 9,500 that are serving 2 years or less. But the provinces are also responsible for pretrial detention called remand custody. And there are at any given time about 14 to 15,000 inmates awaiting, well, they're not inmates, they're accused, serving time awaiting for their trial. So in terms of federal corrections, we're talking about 43 penitentiaries, and we have in excess of 18,000 employees to manage now about 13,000 inmates, because we saw a drop in the average daily count in federal corrections. So let me just talk to you briefly about my office. So if we can go to slide number 3. My office was established in 1973, and we've been, basically we're a prison ombudsman office with jurisdiction to investigate complaints only from those who are either in federal custody or serving the remaining of their sentences in the community, either on parole or conditional release. My office has a great deal of authority, investigative authority, but the bottom line, like any ombudsman office, we simply provide recommendations. So 40 staff, we spend about 450 days in penitentiaries. We investigate about 6,000 complaints a year. So we're fairly busy in what we do. So let me move on to slide number 4 and just give you some of the highlight of what happened to our operations since mid-March of this year. The visit by staff to institutions were suspended, and the great majority of our staff is now working from home. At the very beginning of the pandemic, I had an opportunity as deputy head to position myself and the office as essential services, so critical services, and that provided us with an opportunity to remain open and in our office in operation. So what we've done is we continue to monitor prisons, but we are doing it primarily by phone. So we're contacting each and every penitentiary on a weekly basis. We're talking to the assistant warden operation. We're talking to the heads of healthcare, institutional healthcare. We are also communicating regularly with the inmate committees. We're still doing all the work that we're doing. We have a 1-800 phone line that has not been uninterrupted throughout the pandemic, where inmates can call us. It's a confidential phone calls. And that's what we've been doing primarily until actually early April. Actually, I did a little prison visit, inspection if you want, and we have resumed that function, but only if it's possible on same-day travel. So we're located in Ottawa. There's plenty of penitentiaries on a one-day drive that we can reach. And so far we've done 10 visits of that kind. We are, in the next month, we'll look at an overnight, so we can reach a few more penitentiaries if we go by car, with our own cars, and stay at a hotel for one night and so forth. And maybe in October or November, we'll consider air travel. So that's for our offices. let me tell you now a little bit about what happened in federal corrections. We had overall about 360 inmates that tested positive. Remember, we're talking a base rate of 14,000 inmates. We had 2 deaths due to COVID. And the success story, if there is a success story, is that we had no active case of inmates since the end of May of this year. So that's quite extraordinary. Of course, COVID does not discriminate, but I thought that I would at least give you some idea of, in terms of percentages of who got infected. There was no overrepresentation in terms of Indigenous or Black inmates. Women were actually overrepresented because 2 of the 5 prison for women were infected. So we had a fairly high number there. And we also had in-weight offenders that were disproportionately affected, but that's just the luck of the draw, as you know. So in terms of staff, 142 employees of Correctional Service Canada reported having been tested positive, and the great majority recovered. So if we skip to slide 7, just to give you a sense of the 43 penitentiary, basically we had 5 penitentiary that had some outbreaks. So 5 out of 43 is actually, I think, partly should be seen as a success, especially when we look at the state of readiness that correction was when the pandemic hit. So in terms of early days, conditions of confinement were excessively harsh, and this is how we went down to 0 by end of May. So there was basically our penitentiary were completely shut down to all visits. Most of the staff, the majority of staff actually was sent home, and a very skeleton number of staff ran the penitentiaries. So basically, we fought the virus by solitary confinement. Just to give you a sense of out of time in terms of cells, for those who were in penitentiary, one of the 5 penitentiary that were infected, the out of time cells range from 20 minutes to an hour with no yard time. And for those that they had no outbreak and were unaffected, the out of time in terms of cells range from 1 to 4 hours. So in terms of compliance with statutory obligation and human rights, the compliance was very, very low. So so that means no access to chaplain, elders, program, any sort of services, yard time, fresh air. All this was set aside. At the federal level, there's one thing that allow corrections to do it this way, is that before COVID, there was in excess of 2,000 empty cells in the system. So basically, there's no double bunking or very little double bunking in federal corrections. So you can do basically medical isolation or quarantine or solitary confinement and beat the virus that way. And that's the route federal corrections took. If I move on to slide 8, in terms of the early days, what we saw was some very much inconsistency in the testing. So what we noticed is that some penitentiary where there was an outbreak tested every single inmate, while other penitentiary only tested a few inmates that showed sign of COVID or were suspected. And also, despite my pleading with the commissioner to give inmate mask, after 3 weeks, I got, quite tired and wrote the Minister of Health and the President of the Public Health Agency of Canada to make sure that inmates would receive a mask as well. And within 48 hours, every inmate across the country was provided a mask in those infected sites. So it just very much delay in responding to something. So a correctional officer had masks, but inmates had no mask, which makes very little sense. If we move to slide 9, just another few minutes. In terms of the depopulation strategies, so initially when in the early days of COVID, the Minister of Public Safety and the Government of Canada made some statements about sort of, if you want, looking at depopulation as a way to address the pandemic. And the Minister of Public Safety actually told the corrections and the parole board to work together to see who could be released safely earlier. So despite best effort, we did see a decrease of about 1,000 inmates so far since the start of the pandemic. But the great majority of that decrease was simply due to a drop in admission because the courts weren't functioning and processing individuals, and also a fewer return to custody because of parole suspension or revocation. So very few individuals were released because of COVID, and both corrections and the parole board could not actually provide numbers on those few cases. Let me take my last minute to talk on slide 10. In terms of my current concern is about how slowly the business redemption plan design or implemented by the correction is unrolling. They call it the new normal. This is their strategy. It's just very inconsistently being rolled out. So we have institutions that are up and running in terms of programming, primarily at lower capacity. I would say on average about 50% capacity compared to pre-COVID. But it's been very, when I read the material provided by my investigators, I find it quite extraordinary that institutions are coming online at different speed and different pace. So some may have elders were in place a month and a half ago, and some are just now providing access to elders. So these are the kinds of inconsistencies that we're seeing. There is also some other external mechanism that provide oversight over solitary confinement called now our new structured intervention in units. So we have this brand new legislation that came in November that provides from some oversight, and the same thing for independent chairperson that administer our serious disciplinary matters. And these individuals, for the most part, it's been very inconsistent in terms of whether they would have been able to do their job via video or in person. Whoop, I'm sorry, clearly I'm done. Whoop, there you go. No, okay, I don't know what to do. So in terms of, let me just take 1 minute for the last slide. We did make some recommendations, and as you can see, some of them were accepted. One of them was the whole notion of ensuring that people from outside would come and conduct proper infection prevention and control procedures. This was where corrections was so badly prepared. They had their plan, which was not a bad plan. It was a good plan on paper, but nobody from outside came to verify whether the institution had done it properly. So the local public health authorities never showed up inside the penitentiaries, or even the Public Health Agency of Canada. Nobody from outside stepped in to have a look on their measures. So in terms of lessons learned, this I think is a big one. Mask and testing I talked about. In terms of communication, we received so many complaints from families of offenders and inmates not knowing what was going on inside the penitentiary. So we recommended to the commissioner to decentralize their communication apparatus to allow wardens to provide information directly to the media about what was going on locally. And that was rejected. So the last one that I will certainly talk about is that infection prevention control audits. The Public Health Agency will produce the reports that have been done, and there will be a little bit more transparency, but I think it's still insufficient. So I'll leave it to that. I'm sorry that I ran shortly a little over time. Thank you.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. I think I need that alarm for my morning routine. It's very persistent. It was a fantastic overview of what is happening in Canada, but really sad to see that without that external oversight, there were not even very basic rights being met in relation to masks and testing. And certainly we have the same issues in Australia here, and still there's no widespread testing or availability of masks to people inside. So I really appreciate those insights, and I'm looking forward to the questions to you later on. In the meantime, we have next got Howard Sapers, who served as Canada's Correctional Investigator between 2004 and 2016. So a huge effort there. He works as a consultant providing strategic, policy and operational advice to a variety of clients regarding oversight and correctional practice. Welcome, Howard.
Hi, hello, thank you very much for including me in this. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Nishnabeg people. They have been the stewards of this land since time immemorial, and I am privileged to live and work here. I understand that if I press this green arrow, you're going to get to see my screen. Okay, I hope that's working. Let me begin, I guess, in terms of talking about, Ivan talked about the federal provincial split in Canada, and he gave us a wonderful introduction to what's happening in federal corrections. I'm going to spend my time talking about provincial corrections. There's about 25,000 people being held in custody tonight somewhere in a jail in Canada. Sadly, that about 2/3 of those numbers are pretrial custody. Those numbers have been going down since COVID, and I'm going to break into a little bit of detail about that. But even those numbers don't really give you the full breadth of provincial territorial corrections in this country. In the province of Ontario, which is Canada's most populous province, there'll be about 60,000 people that will cycle through the province's 25 correctional facilities. So 60,000 people means you've got very short stays, lots of instability, lots of movement, which again just exacerbates the risk when it comes to an infectious disease like COVID. There's other people that will be speaking tonight that will be talking about why jails are so dangerous. I just think it's worth remembering that this is a very compromised population to begin with, in very oppressive conditions generally, and then we layer on top of that this pandemic. And across Canada, there were uneven responses and some missteps, but there's also been some learning and some good news. I'm going to give you a couple of provincial snapshots in a minute. I just want to say that there was a variety of initiatives. And so when we go through the provinces, I'm going to talk about some innovation and some just going back to actually doing what you're supposed to do, and a little bit of cooperation from outside of the corrections system as well. One of the things that I was really taken with was the willingness in a couple of provinces to extend their court time. I mean, this has been a problem in our country for a long time. I'm sure Canada's not unique in this, but getting the bench to actually kick in and put in like a full work week, if I can be so brash as to put it that way. It's been a challenge, and we saw some provinces really rise up to that challenge. We had some of the biggest hits in COVID of this country happened around Easter, and we had some of the courts sitting throughout the Easter weekend to make sure that people weren't spending extra time in remand centers because of the holiday. So this is what the, if you want to take a high level look, this is what's happened in Canada year to year, April 2019 to April 2020. Two takeaways from this slide: very stable populations over the year until COVID, and then a bit of a dip in sentence custody and a much bigger decline in pretrial custody. And Talia, I think you remarked on that yourself, your experience in Australia as well. I can't be the least bit disappointed about the decline in remand custody. And when people talk about the new normal, I think one of the real challenges is going to be, how do we make permanent some of these right now temporary policy and procedure changes that have resulted in this kind of decline? So we're going to have a dividend from this whole experience. It might actually be, in this country, the first real serious work in keeping the remand population down. So start with some of the snapshots. In Ontario, we had about a 30% decline between month to month. So there's a rapid decline between the middle of March and the middle of April. When I talk to people in the system here in Ontario, they tell me that there was more change in how they did their work in 4 weeks than for many of them, for one of them said specifically, that in their 40-year career. Embracing technology, taking risks, actually doing what they're supposed to do according to their own policies. And they even convinced the provincial government to make some regulatory changes to give them some more leeway. They were very quick to react when there was one outbreak in a treatment intensive facility for sentenced men. They closed the facility instead of locking everybody up. And they moved people into vacant space in other facilities. Good news, bad news, many of them were then locked up and put and either segregated or put into very restricted regimes in terms of movement and association. That's normalized now. The facility has been sanitized. People are back. The count remains to be down, and there was no subsequent outbreak. British Columbia, their early results weren't as impressive as Ontario's, about 6% of its custodial count, mostly in people serving intermittent sentences. These are weekend sentences. I hope that people that are releasing all of these intermittent sentenced prisoners will come to their senses and realize that intermittent sentences are a waste of time and there's no public safety hit when they were all released. So this is perhaps an opportunity for another COVID dividend. We'll see. British Columbia is now much more to the national average in terms of its reduction, and we're now seeing about day-to-day counts vary, but about a 25% decrease in custody, split roughly along the lines of their sentence and pretrial populations. Manitoba, one of the smaller provinces on the edge of the prairies, really ramped up its use of temporary absences, and they reduced their custody population quite dramatically, and they've managed to keep that down. And again, they're another jurisdiction that's now looking to see whether or not these count numbers can be safely maintained. Nova Scotia, one of our Atlantic provinces, custodial population decrease of 50%. Again, temporary absence is intermittent, but they also went further and immediately looked for individuals who were within 30 days of either warrant expiry of their expected release date. Nova Scotia was one of those provinces where the provincial chief judge raised her hand early and said, we're going to extend our sitting hours, we're going to sit through the Easter weekend. And she's still dealing with some flack, I think, from some of her colleagues over that, but they got the job done and that was good. If I can go back to Ontario for a second, Ontario overall reduced their population by about 30%, but in the first 6 weeks, they reduced the women in custody by 50%. And the vast majority of the women that were released were Indigenous women that were in pretrial custody. So Newfoundland and Labrador, small jurisdiction, 17 prisoners were released within 30 days of their sentence end. This is an ongoing process. Every week their executive meets and they comb through the files and they're looking for people to release. Again, we're seeing a bump down in the remand population, mostly because of activity on the bail side. So in sum, what we've seen is that after relatively stable populations in provincial and territorial jails in Canada, COVID has resulted in the first profound decrease in those populations in quite a while. And there is activity and some energy in trying to find ways to keep those counts down, particularly on the remand side. And that will necessarily, I think, also affect the sentence population. All 13 provincial and territorial correctional services in Canada have experienced these decreases. The national average is around 25 or 26% across the board. And the proportion I expect of people being released will begin to probably come closer together with, like, maybe 60-40 remand and sentence instead of it being about 80% remand now, right now, and about 20% sentence. I think that this will work its way through. The last point I'll make about all of this is what's been really interesting for me to watch from a systems perspective. It's not what corrections has done or not done. There's lots we can talk about there. But it's how the rest of the players in the system also pitched in. So this has been more of an all of government, or at least an all of justice sector response as well. So there was a change in police charging behavior, in Crown behavior in terms of prosecutions and bail applications, in the use of appearance notices, and also engaging social agencies and provincial and territorial operated social service, particularly around housing, to ensure that people had some place to be that was safe for them if they weren't in fact being held in a remand cell. So I'm encouraged by that because some of these partnerships have been pretty frayed across the country over the years, and just beginning to see people coming together to respond to this crisis. And so I'll just end with that note that I'm hoping that some of these things can be sustained. I think I talked fast enough to make up for the extra time that Ivan used. So I'll, there, whoops, how come I can't, it's not letting me, there we go. So I will, I'll leave my remarks there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Howard. That is absolutely heartening to see those declines. And like I said, it does to some extent mirror what's been going on in Australia. And it has been really that not only interagency approach, but absolutely there have been, social services involved, but really it's been a lot up to the work of activist lawyers who've brought submissions calling for bail to be granted where their clients face risks in relation to COVID, or even risks in relation to the restricted prison environments. And these lawyers have worked with Aboriginal organisations and other grassroots organisations to make sure that their release is safe. And I think that what we can see is that despite the fall in prison populations, our communities are just as safe, if not safer. And so I think it does have some really important lessons that we should all take stock from. Our next speaker is Fiona Kuyumjan, who's a family physician, public health physician, and epidemiologist. Fiona has been working as a family physician in a jail in Hamilton, in Ontario, for 12 years. She's also an assistant professor in the Department of Family Medicine at McMaster University, where she leads a program of research focused on the health of people who experience imprisonment. Welcome, Fiona.
Thank you so much. And if I seem nervous, it's only because I'm scared that my dog's going to start barking or my children will continue to engage in the battle for later bedtime. But here's hoping you won't know anything about that other than what I just told you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I hope you can see that okay. Great, thanks. So I know the focus is primarily on the experience within prisons, and yeah, great to hear the comments that you've both made, Ivan and Howard. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the experience of people after they're released from prison, recognizing that arguably we can make the case that the state has particular obligations for people after they have held them in custody. And also to try to include all people in programs to prevent adverse impacts from pandemic response, as well as to protect people from the COVID-19 itself. So my focus is really, if we think about following the population after people spend time in prison, following them into the community, and what is that experience like during the coronavirus pandemic. So we know that the baseline health status of people who experience incarceration, and in particular at the time of release, is worse than the average health status of people. So both compared to other people in the general population, the health status of people experiencing incarceration is worse, and then compared to other periods of their lives, at the time after release, people tend to have worse status than at other times in their lives. And so I've just listed a few conditions. You can say, oh, why didn't you put something else? I just sort of off the top of my head, here are a few examples. So we know that people have a higher prevalence of chronic conditions, including mental illness and addictions, sexually transmitted and bloodborne infections. I'm gonna shift this window over, as well as cancer, seizure disorder, so just again to name a few. We also know that there's an increased risk of injuries in this population, including intentional and unintentional injuries, and in particular at the time of release, we see a very high risk of overdose and overdose-related mortality. And then people face challenges to housing, employment, and income, again, in particular at the time of release from custody. So worse health status at baseline, and not only worse health status, but also worse or higher unmet health needs. So higher needs, but also a smaller proportion of those needs being met. And this is true even in the context of a universal healthcare system such as exists in Canada. So again, a few specific examples that I know something about based on work that I've been involved in with many colleagues and partners. So looking at things like access to opioid agonist treatment. So people who have opioid use disorder, we know this is a very high risk population for overdose. Obviously, you know, incarceration itself often reflects the fact that people have opioid use disorder in the context of the criminalization of drug use. So that notwithstanding, people still have limited access to opioid agonist treatment in the community and in correctional facilities. Psychiatric care post-release. So we've done some research looking at people who have diagnosed psychotic disorders and what's their time to accessing psychiatric care. And it's much longer than what would be considered appropriate care or even meeting minimum standards of care. People with HIV, we know they're less likely to have access to HIV treatment than other people with HIV who don't experience incarceration. We've done some recent work looking at prenatal care, so women who are pregnant who experience incarceration, and other things like cancer screening. So again, I just gave a sample here partly to show that this isn't limited to one aspect of health or healthcare. People have a lot of challenges in terms of their health, and also a large proportion of unmet health needs. And I should say again, this is a population focus. So I'm talking about on average. This isn't true of everyone. There is obviously, it's a very heterogeneous population, but when we talk about the population as a whole, these are some of the issues that we find that people encounter. So then we, on top of this situation, we layer the coronavirus pandemic, which, and this is largely conceptual. I don't have a lot of data, so happy to be challenged on anything I'm saying, including this. We see increased needs for a large proportion of people in this population, and decreased access to the things that people need to address their needs. So in terms of increased needs, we see increases in psychological stress due to public health measures. So this can both be coming out of a correctional facility where people have had to spend a large proportion of their time in segregation, or haven't had access to the programming, including discharge planning, that they might have had in custody, as well as the public health measures in the community. So again, having to spend a lot of time physical distancing, isolation, so not having your access to your social networks, which can be so critical as you're reintegrating. Fear of COVID-19, I think this is pervasive across the whole population, but certainly increases psychological stress at a particularly challenging time, financial strain, and slower criminal justice system administrative processes, which of course there are exceptions that I'm delighted to hear about, the promising work that Howard, you spoke about. And then housing. So as much as I think we are all enthusiastic about the decarceration that's happened, so more diversion from custody and more early release, that wasn't met with sort of an appropriate increase in acceptable housing, which means that the limited housing that is available now has more people trying to get that housing. So yeah, and obviously much of that housing is problematic in terms of overcrowding and ability to, like circling back to the public health measures, ability to follow public health guidance in terms of physical distancing. And the third point here, the drug supply is more toxic. So I have less expertise on this, but I have seen evidence from Canada that suggests that there is a higher proportion of people with overdose deaths, a higher proportion of those people who have died had exposure to fentanyl and to fentanyl analogs than what is typical, and similarly, a higher proportion of fentanyl analogs in drugs through drug checking services. So yeah, I mean, in the context of people being more likely to be alone and therefore to be using alone and having a more toxic drug supply, obviously a recipe for overdose, especially when coupled with decreased access. So I'll just skip to the third one because I'm talking about it, decreased access to harm reduction services. So that includes things like needle and syringe exchange, but also supervised consumption sites. And in the context of, again, just I already said it, but people having less access to those services, more likely to use alone or to use in riskier situations in terms of overdose risk. And going back to the first bullet in the decreased access, so for outpatient care, a lot of outpatient care in Canada shifted to providing services remotely, which can be very challenging if you don't have access to a computer or even a regular cell phone, and more limited hours in scope, again, on top of existing challenges in access to services. This makes it more difficult. And emergency departments, so of course emergency departments remained open, but I think that the level of acceptability of using emergency departments changed, and that's both from the perspective of potential patients as well as staff. So it sort of became a less desirable place, whereas I often conceptualize the emergency department as part of our social safety net. If people have challenges with access to care, they are able to access many types of care through the emergency department, and that became a less palatable option during the coronavirus pandemic. So I'll skip harm reduction services because I touched on it already, and then just say social services. So I already talked about rapid releases, in particular in April, meant that many people didn't get discharge planning as they were leaving custody, and then the challenges in terms of accessing social services in the community with the same issues as outpatient care were present. So many challenges with respect to that. How do these changes impact health? Really, we're going to see this. I'm afraid we're going to see this over the months and years to come. I expect that there are the immediate harms from substance use. There will be chronic impacts in terms of mental health, chronic disease, financial situation, housing situation. The image that I put here, overdose deaths in British Columbia in 2020. So this is not specific to people who have experienced incarceration, but you can see that if you look from January and February, where we have just under 80 people who have died, March, April, May, and June, the numbers continue to rise, and these are the highest numbers of overdose-related deaths in British Columbia, which has struggled with an opioid overdose crisis for many years. So presumably a large proportion of these people, as has been the case in the past, have experienced incarceration. So we can just start to see these are some of the harms experienced by the population in general, and I would expect that these populations are enriched for people who have a history of incarceration and likely recent incarceration. So of course, I wanted to spend a minute talking specifically about COVID-19 infection, and both in terms of exposures and then risk of adverse outcomes of infection. So I already mentioned the challenges that many people face in terms of housing. They might be more likely to be in crowded settings without the ability to implement recommended physical distancing. Or even, ventilation, like opening a window. So I said shelters and congregate care settings, for example, for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. But even people who aren't in shelters or congregate care settings, I would hypothesize that people are more likely to be in overcrowded private dwellings also. And then employment, so people likely less likely to work in occupations that would support remote work. So again, not being able to do the things that the government keeps telling everyone to do. And then the second part, so risk of adverse outcomes of infection. So if people do get infected, then they might be more likely to have serious adverse outcomes, and that's because of multimorbidity and possibly, I put a question mark because I don't know this for sure, delayed access to testing and care. So I'm only saying that because we know that people lack good access to high quality testing and care. People experience stigma. So for many reasons, people might be more likely to delay their access to testing and care. Of course, that would increase the risk of having worse outcomes of infection. So to summarize, we know this population has high baseline unmet health needs, and also that during COVID-19, likely increased needs and decreased service access, and specifically increased risks of COVID-19 infection and adverse outcomes. So this suggests a large and likely disproportionately high impact of COVID-19 on the health of this population, so people post-release. And I only unfortunately have a question mark for opportunities to mitigate impacts. But certainly, I think we could agree that this period of the time around release represents sort of shared jurisdiction between people, between correctional authorities and the community. So hopefully some opportunity to partner there. That's the hopeful note. And my favorite picture, closing the gap is good for Canada's health. I could switch this out for Australia's health. Just recognizing there are so many gaps. I mean, there's the gap in terms of what people experience as they leave correctional facilities, but also I think just there's some populations don't have access to the best practices, both best programs that are available for much of the general population. That's it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. You did that flawlessly despite children and pets in the background. But it's a really tragic depiction of the binary of increased needs and decreased access. But I think you make the wider point really well that health issues and a lack of access are not unique to the pandemic, and more broadly, not unique to marginalised and oppressed people in society. So it's a problem inside and outside of prisons. I'm going to open it up to questions. I have a few. I've also received some in the chat. The first one is from Andrea Lush, and her question is to Howard. She says, I would be interested to know if the changes in policing practices in Canada happened organically, or if there were directives and a shift in policy.
Probably the latter. So the information I have is anecdotal because I haven't been inside those discussions. But the Crown and police both received directives within their organizations in terms of using all of the options available, I think is generally the way that it was put. Ensure the proper use of discretion, and some even went so far as to say with the stated intent of reducing either remand placements or prosecutions at that time, because there was also a slowdown in the courts. In spite of what I said about some courts actually expanding hours, these were courts of first appearance. These weren't certainly the trial courts or the sentencing courts or whatever. So there were lots of delays. So people did get directives, and it appears, at least in larger jurisdictions across Canada, those directives had the net effect of fewer people being presented to the court for bail decisions, let alone what happened once they were in court, let's say a remand hearing or bail hearing.
Perfect. The next question is from Maddie, and I think anyone can answer this, maybe specifically Ivan and Howard, but Fiona chime in. So he asks so had Canada a robust, effective NPM in place, would the impact have been significant, especially in care homes for the elderly?
Well, I'll try. This is a little bit outside corrections, but I do believe that we had both in the province of Quebec and Ontario very high numbers of death in long care facilities. And I think there's been a lot of people from outside independently move in after that have reported on the horrible conditions of some of those homes. And I think that if they would have been a rigorous, robust sort of system of inspection in place, it would have flagged all those things. Whether the provincial governments would have injected the money in a non-pandemic situation and respond to their recommendation is a different issue, but I think it would have been, at least the red flag would have been a lot clearer.
I'll only add simply that I'm a big believer that the more oversight and the more independent that oversight is, the more accountable the system becomes. And so I think the presence of a robust NPM would have made difference before the pandemic as well. As Ivan mentioned, everybody had a response plan. The plans may be great, but the implementation, if you're not ready to implement that plan, or if you don't have the capacity to implement that plan because of budget restraint, etc., then the plan's not worth the paper it's written on. I think a strong NPM in Canada would help going forward. And even now, as the world is preparing for another peak, another wave of this particular pandemic, how do we make sure that the lessons have been learned? How do we make sure that Ivan doesn't have to go to bat and start pounding the table again for something as simple as masks to be made available to the in custody population.
Thank you. The next question's from Stephen, and it's for Fiona, and I think really resonates with some of the issues in Australia. So the question is, should prisons have responsibility for post-release transitional care? And how can we break down these barriers during COVID to make sure that people don't give up on decarceration for fear of poor linkages to care and housing?
So the first part of the question I got, and then I didn't get the second part. So maybe I'll start by answering the first part, and then if you don't mind, you can say the second part again. I think absolutely, and I think actually like that is. I think there's lots of work that corrections and correctional authorities are squarely responsible for, but I think if we can position the time of release as a shared jurisdiction, shared responsibility, that's a win. I think that creates an opportunity to like leverage, okay, you know, what are best practices in the community? How can we bring community into correctional facilities, whereas they are traditionally kept totally separate and don't communicate and have nothing to do with each other. Of course, with exceptions, including probation and parole, but in terms of, you know, the areas in which I work, like healthcare, social services. So yeah, I definitely think that period, I mean, the example of post-release overdose is a clear one. So people are at risk of post-release overdose because they have been in custody. And I think because of that, corrections needs to be involved in programs that support people decreasing their risk as they leave correctional facilities. And can you just reiterate the second part of the question? Sorry. You're just on mute, I think.
Yep. So just to clarify, also these questions are from Bree Williams, but the latter part was, how can we break down these barriers during COVID to make sure that people don't give up on decarceration for fear of poor linkages to care and housing?
Well, I would invite others to like contribute their ideas in the chat window, just so we harness more people's brains, people that can handle more than one part of a question, as an example, cognitively. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm not sure that I have a clear answer for that. Maybe I'll ask Ivan and Howard if you have any comments to make.
Can I just say, like I mentioned, in Australia, we've had these issues emerge among, I would say, academics and some advocates, that basically because there aren't supports on the outside, we should keep people inside. And I really feel like that's a false binary, and we should be advocating for decarceration that is safe and that provides for people's rights to housing and other services, including rights to family. So I think we spend a lot of money, as all of our countries do. Our states spend billions of dollars on prisons, and decarceration should be about shifting those resources. And I think it's been disappointing to see people who you know, fairly progressive in this space give up on decarceration because of services rather than deepen their understanding of decarceration.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, thanks. Talia, I have heard those arguments articulated in particular around housing. And to me, it just seems very paternalistic that we would assume that because there are challenges to meeting people's needs for housing, that we would decide for them that they therefore need to stay in custody. It just seems overly simplistic. And like, I think, as you say, like, you know, a sort of solution focused approach would mean that we have to build better options for housing instead of just say housing is a problem, therefore people should stay in custody, which And maybe some people would make that choice, but certainly I wouldn't want to make it for people, given what I've seen the experience can look like for people.
And Fiona, you turn it around. You can turn it around. I've been doing some work in one jurisdiction, and they actually, they said, well, this is housing. Like this is housing. And I said, it's not housing. And if it is, then it's the most expensive, inefficient way to provide housing imaginable. So there is this paternalism that, we still hear judges saying, well, I'll put them there for their own good. Winter's coming. You hear those kinds of things still. So there is still a lot of work to do, but it is absolutely a false argument to say that we can't release these people early because they have no place safe to go. Because the next question is, okay, when their warrant expires in 30 days, what are your plans? It's like, so let's get serious about finding those alternatives and leveraging the resources that exist, because there are lots of them.
Let me perhaps, can I just finish up on the, just give an example of a year and a half ago, my office issued a report on aging and dying in prison. And what we saw was that they are men and women that are well past their parole eligibility period, that are suffering from dementia, that are palliative, that have a great deal of mobility issues, that are hooked up on oxygen tanks, bedridden. And we made a whole sorts of recommendations to try to move these individuals over a year and a half ago to the community, to buy beds and build capacity for long-term care facilities to take care of these individuals. In the federal level, there is at least 700 inmates that are age 65 and over, and the great majority of those pose no risk to the public safety. So all those recommendations did not go anywhere, unfortunately, and the report did not get traction. And now we've got a pandemic, and the government is saying, well, we should try to release those individuals. But then, where are you going to release them in a pandemic when long-term care facility in Canada are struggling to contain the outbreaks? So that's why I think in the time where there's no pandemic, if there was no traction, it's excessively difficult to do the right thing in a pandemic. So I hope that when things calm down in the future, that there will be some lessons learned about this. So this is just an example.
Yeah, and on that, I've got a question from Dean Lloyd, which is he's heard that the Housing First model designed by Sam Zemberis is becoming policy in Canada. Is this model still happening during COVID, or has it been put on hold?
It's Fiona. I don't know where things stand with that model. I mean, it was rolled out in a large implementation science trial, and now has been adopted in several jurisdictions, but I don't have any more information on it, Howard or Ivan, or I can see Amanda's on the line too. Does anybody else? Or I don't know if others are here from Canada. But
yeah, it's a jurisdictional issue in part in Canada as well, because it's federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal. Everybody has a role in social housing, and so I'm not sure that it would even be fair to say that Housing First is the policy for Canada. I would say that the federal government made a huge investment through the Mental Health Commission of Canada and rolled out that model in, I think it was five sites. And those 5 sites are all still operating that model to some extent. And I don't know how that's been impacted by COVID. I have no idea.
Great. And I might just ask one last question from Bree to you, Howard. And maybe, Fiona and Ivan might want to also contribute. And to summarize her question, she's asking what is the takeaway from the lessons in Canada for the US? What's kind of the, I guess, successes, or what can we learn from its failures?
Oh boy, sure. I'd really appreciate if Ivan and Fiona wanted to jump in first. So, I think that for me there are a couple of takeaways, and one is that this is beyond corrections, and it should be, and it needs to be. And so, if corrections can actually somehow be a facilitator or broker, a connection maker, and give up a little bit of its control, that would be a good thing. And I think we're seeing that happen in a few jurisdictions. And so maybe that's a lesson. I think in the United States, there's been much more activity in the courts and in state legislatures and in Congress in terms of people proposing bills and having a debate at the political level, which is not happening so much in Canada. I am aware that there are lawsuits, and there's been lots of, I should have mentioned the defense bar when I talked about the other players in Canada. The defense bar has been very quick, and there are some class actions being formulated, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the other lesson learned then is that this is not a single approach. So you need policy, you need regulatory change, you need operational changes, you need some goodwill. And you need some champions. I don't think there's any magic in all of that. I've been inspired by a lot of the things that I'm getting from the prison policy org from the states, doing their state-by-state updates through this pandemic. It's been some really good information that I have been shamelessly, trying to import into a lot of that into Canada as well. So I think it goes both ways.
Well, maybe I'll just briefly comment on this one and add to Howard's closing remarks there. I think for me I'd like to leave on a sort of a more positive note. I think these are exceptional circumstances, and corrections, yes, was slow to react, probably could have done much better, quicker, and if their organization was, innovative and sort of flexible and able to react quicker. But I think we have to also give a little credit in terms of that these are exceptional circumstances, and sometimes when you do have these challenges, it takes time for big organization, big bureaucracy to react. We now, I think, are much, and this is where the positive things, I think now in a much better position should a second wave hits Canada, at least at the federal level. I would say we're in a much better situation in terms of state of readiness and best practices. It was growing pains to go through it, but I think now I'm hopeful that if another penitentiary is affected, that things will get resolved much more efficiently, effectively, and promptly. So I think we have to again give a little leeway to a lot of the men and women who have shown up in penitentiary and trying to do the right thing and run those penitentiaries the best way they can. If I take the example of the penitentiary that I visited during the outbreak, the warden there, this woman was a fantastic woman with tons of energy. Overnight, she saw her, 200 correctional officers was reduced to 50 because 150 correctional officers were sent to be quarantined, and she, kept that penitentiary running. They clearly weren't ready for it. They had to borrow equipment, for example, to sanitize officers' gear to the local hockey ring. Only in Canada you would do that. So they actually borrow the sanitation equipment from the hockey players. So I think it's extraordinary things, but I think now we're in a better position. Growing pains, and I think it was the same thing in society. A great deal of diversity, the way different provinces had different levels of restrictions, different local public health authority imposed different types of restrictions. Very difficult for a national or big bureaucracy to be fine-tuned to those things. So anyway.
Thank you. Fiona, did you want to say anything in the last 30 seconds?
Sure, I'll just say two things quickly. I guess first, just, make sure that this setting is on the radar, because often it isn't, or at least it's not one of the first things being considered. And then second, sort of shifting from setting to thinking about the population, and not just that the population is at higher risk, which arguably they are, but also that they're at higher risk for disproportionate impacts of the pandemic response, as well as the infection itself.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an excellent point to end this part of the webinar on. We've had some requests to just make the break 5 minutes. Maybe Ivan, turn on that alarm of yours, and we'll return to discuss the experience in the United States with Bree, Adnan and Homer. So please stay around, be 5 minutes, and we'll get going. So I'm going to now begin firstly by thanking everyone who spoke on Canada in the last session. Thank you again, Ivan, Fiona and Howard. It was truly brilliant, and we have so many more questions that we can maybe take offline or continue in the YouTube comments. We now have the session on the United States and their experience with the pandemic in prisons. Our first speaker is Bree Williams, who's a physician and professor of medicine at the University of California and founding director of Amend, Changing Correctional Culture. Dr. Williams spent her early career focused on improving the health of incarcerated older adults and people with serious illness. Her research has called for increased attention to the impact of solitary confinement, compassionate release policies, and improved systems for defining, recognising and responding to disability, dementia and serious illness in the correctional environment. She served as a medical expert on several lawsuits related to confinement, and in 2014 she visited the correctional service in Norway, where she heard the motto, "In Norway, people go to court to be punished, they go to prison to become better neighbours." This motto underpins her work and vision. Thanks for joining us, Bree.
Thank you so much for having me. Let me spend a minute figuring out my screens. Can you see my slides? Do you see my slide? Thumbs up? Yes? Okay. Okay, great. Well, it's an incredible honor to join my fellow panelists today. And thank you for inviting me to speak a little bit about COVID-19 and the lessons from the US prison experience. So Amend at UCSF, just very briefly, draws on public health, human rights, and Norwegian correctional practices to transform US prisons to focus on the dignity, humanity, and health of residents and staff. During COVID-19, Amend has been laser focused on lending our expertise on healthcare and public health to correctional systems and affected residents and staff to try to improve the US correctional system's response to the pandemic. As you know, COVID-19 has had an outsized impact in US prisons, where over 119,000 residents have been infected, nearly 1,000 have died, at least 23,000 staff have been infected, and many have died. This is San Quentin, a California state prison near San Francisco, where over 50% of the population is older than age 50. Hundreds have multiple COVID-19 risk factors. On May 30th, approximately 120 patients were moved by bus from a prison 6 hours away that was in the midst of an active outbreak to San Quentin, supposedly for their protection, basically, because San Quentin had no cases at the time. Unfortunately, by June 12th, there were 16 documented cases of COVID-19 at San Quentin that had been imported from the other facility. And on June 13th, our team was asked to visit San Quentin to assess the situation for the state. Our evaluation team issued an urgent memo with our findings from the June 13th visit, sounding an alarm for what we found, which was a profoundly high risk of rapid COVID-19 transmission that could easily overwhelm prison health services and local community hospitals. For example, we found antiquated facilities. Many were built at the turn of the last century. They had poor ventilation. The front of each cell has open bars, making the packed housing units essentially resemble enormous dormitory-style living from a respiratory perspective. We found serious overcrowding with 2 people assigned to most small cells, limited staff testing, no limitations on staff movement between housing units. We also found that the prison was inadequately staffed or trained to respond to a large outbreak. Staff were hampered by very delayed COVID-19 testing, which reached 6 to 9 day turnaround times, and residents were scared. Staff needed help. Sadly, over the coming days, our fears were realized. We witnessed a massive super spreader event at San Quentin Prison. Here you can see that in California at the time, there were 6 cases of COVID-19 per 1,000 California residents. While in the California prison system as a whole, there were nearly 48 cases per 1,000 people. But by early July, San Quentin had reached 427 cases per 1,000 residents. By September 4th, over 2,200 residents have been infected, and as of today, 26 residents have died. Our urgent recommendations from that memo have now become 6 urgent lessons. I'm going to review them today. The first lesson is decarcerate. Many incarcerated people are in poor health. They live in overcrowded environments. At least in the US, over 170,000 are older adults. The rationale for public health-focused decarceration is twofold. First, the foundational principles of COVID-19 mitigation are to physically distance, to quarantine exposures, and to test and isolate cases. And these actions simply cannot be accomplished without space. Second, the goal for every community should be to minimize the numbers of all people residing in any congregate living environment. This population reduction decreases risk of infection to those who are released and able to move to a place where they can physically distance from others, but it also increases the availability of the limited health resources in prisons and nearby hospitals for those who remain and may get ill. And it's important to recognize the critical need, especially during a pandemic, to link people to post-release healthcare services and housing so that decarceration can reach its most meaningful impact. The second lesson, and I apologize, this is a little bit longer than the others, is to understand and employ the ethical use of medical isolation and quarantine, not solitary confinement. So as a reminder, solitary confinement goes by many different monikers, including the whole, ADSEG, restrictive housing, many others. In it, people are housed approximately 22 hours a day, 7 days a week, in a cell roughly the size of a parking spot. They eat, sleep, and toilet in this small space. They have minimal access to showers and exercise, limited to no contact with loved ones, rarely engage in meaningful programming. So what does this have to do with COVID-19? Well, here's an account of someone tweeting from a US prison last month, describing his concerns about solitary confinement. He writes, "Many were sent to solitary confinement for being sick with COVID-19. My friend finally got out after 45 days of being in a cage alone. I started counting how many words I spoke in a day. He told me one day I spoke only 6 words to myself." And this is where we hit a major roadblock in the fight to contain COVID-19 in prisons, because people who are exposed or infected obviously cannot be in close proximity to others, or COVID-19 will spread. But fear of solitary confinement among incarcerated people based on years of dangerous use of this practice deters people from reporting symptoms, which leads to the worsening of COVID-19 outbreaks. And frankly, as medical professionals, use of punitive isolation for someone who's sick also contravenes medical ethics. So first step to addressing this problem is to clarify what is expected in the ethical use of quarantine and medical isolation in correctional facilities. And it's clear, honestly, to me at least, that many medical professionals are even uncertain about these terms. I frankly was at the beginning of this pandemic. So first, what is quarantine? It's the practice of separating a person who is exposed to or is expected to possibly have a contagious disease until it can be determined whether he or she will develop the disease. Basically, when COVID-19 status is unknown, people have to be separated from others. Getting back to lesson 1, this practice requires space. Each facility must have uninhabited cells so that patients can who are in dorm settings or who are living in areas with common airspace can be temporarily housed alone pending testing results. In contrast, medical isolation is the practice of separating a person with a confirmed disease until they are no longer contagious. People who have a confirmed diagnosis can be medically isolated alone or with others who also have laboratory confirmed diagnoses. So the people who have symptoms but who have not tested positive or who refuse to test still have to be housed alone because we don't know if they can infect others or if they can be infected. And again, medical isolation also requires extra space, although well-ventilated common areas can be converted into shared medical isolation units for those who test positive. So in what ways should medical isolation and quarantine be the same as solitary confinement? And the answer is pretty simple. The only commonality should be the physical separation from other people in a single cell, if it's quarantine, and sometimes in a common area with others who have laboratory confirmed diagnoses in the case of medical isolation. What conditions should be present for ethical quarantine or isolation? Well, first, care and conditions should be overseen by medical staff, not custody. This is not a housing arrangement. This is a medical intervention. It should be treated as such. As a result, patients should receive daily visits from healthcare and medical staff and mental health staff. They should get clear communication about the expected duration of the quarantine or isolation and the rationale for its continued use. They should have the opportunity to go outside and exercise, at least in the case of medical isolation, which can last much longer than quarantine. And they should have enhanced access to television, tablets, radio, reading, writing materials, basically anything that can make the separation less psychologically damaging. This is a terrifying time, and they should have accessible means of communicating with loved ones. What proactive steps can correctional healthcare and departments take to ensure the ethical use of quarantine and medical isolation? Well, again, lesson one, we need space. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that correctional facilities should not operate at or probably even close to 100% capacity. Healthcare leaders absolutely need to be able to respond to the demands of infectious disease and move people around quickly, create isolation and quarantine units, and they can't do that with a full institution. Second, express gratitude. Asymptomatic people, young people who are exposed, or those with mild symptoms are doing a public service by telling a healthcare professional that they have symptoms. Their actions are actually keeping the community safe, and they may never actually get sick. We should thank and incentivize them. And third, communicate. Facilities should be engaging so-called inmate and family advisory councils as partners to identify ways to optimize communication with patients, to understand their concerns, and to minimize them. One of the things is demonstrating how the quarantine and medical isolation units are meaningfully different than solitary confinement and offering incentives, things like enhanced canteen, more family visits by video, things like that. So I promise the remaining lessons are much shorter. Lesson 3 is to optimize occupational health. COVID-19 reminds us that our health is interconnected. Hundreds of thousands of staff enter and leave jails and prisons each day, at least in the United States. These staff bring infection back and forth and back, from the community to work, from work to the community. As a result, prison health, more than in any other time, is truly community public health. And many correctional staff are in poor health themselves. Many work in unsanitary, also overcrowded workplaces. One officer told us in a survey we conducted recently, we no longer call ourselves essential, we say we're sacrificial. Another said, I am my mother and father's ride for appointments and shopping. I need to be healthy. Yes, I know I signed up for this job, but none of us saw this coming. It's scary as hell. Too many people are not taking this seriously. Here are just a few examples of ways to shore up correctional occupational health during the COVID-19 pandemic. Hopefully Australia has this locked in. If it doesn't, take note. Universal screening for symptoms and exposures before entry to the prison every day. No cost testing in hotspots with widespread community transition or in prisons with outbreaks. Organize staff and residents into cohorts that practice physical distancing from each other as much as possible. Institute a culture of health and culture of health policies such as paid sick leave that requires people to stay home when they're exposed or feel sick. Provide access and training in the use of PPE, hand sanitizer, soap, universal masking, enhanced protection when in contact with infected residents or moving them. And provide staff with temporary housing, hoteling, basically for staying after work to protect families during facility outbreaks. Lesson 4 is to create a centralized outbreak response team. Now, this is really important because lessons learned in one facility have to be transferred to other outbreak facilities where you start all over again with the next outbreak. And few, if any, healthcare staff, few of us have ever been trained in actually how to stop a super spreader event. I had never even heard the term super spreader event, and I'm a physician before COVID-19. We generally need outside assistance and expertise, epidemiologists, public health people, to take the next steps. So here are some examples of positions that could be featured in a centralized response team. An environment of care lead who optimizes ventilation, sanitation, patient flow in the prison to mitigate COVID-19 spread throughout the facility, to cohort staff, and who trains in PPE use and infection control, both to staff and to residents. A healthcare custody coordination lead who partners with custody to assess on a daily basis the housing of residents for medical isolation and quarantine at the discretion of the medical leadership. Make sure that the medical people are at the center of that housing decision. A COVID-19 testing lead who coordinates testing of all residents, healthcare staff, and custody, and who ensures rapid testing turnaround time and that residents find out what the results are of their tests and that they are accurate. And an epidemiologist analyst who develops and reviews line listings of all active and resolved cases. Lesson 5, and there's just 2 more. It's been incredibly important to clarify the rights of seriously ill patients who are incarcerated. And this is important at all times. It's especially important when populations are being decimated through a pandemic. And it's important for both correctional healthcare professionals, but also for community healthcare professionals. At a minimum, ethical care for hospitalized, incarcerated patients in the community who have serious illness should include the right to self-determination or the ability to choose what medical interventions they do or do not want. The right to name a healthcare proxy to make medical decisions in the event that they cannot make the decision themselves. These rights are usually and should be protected in an advanced care plan, which correctional healthcare professionals should be ensuring that each patient has completed, and community health professionals should be reevaluating upon admission. And frankly, patients just should have the right, the opportunity to say goodbye to their loved ones at the end of their life, even if it's just through a video or phone call. And these prison outbreaks have posed tremendous confusion for community healthcare staff, hospital staff who are not used to taking care of this many patients from prisons. At one point, we had 90 patients from San Quentin in community hospitals at one time. These people are coming and going, and more patients are coming every day, and more patients are being discharged back to the prison every day. They've just never seen anything like this. And so as a result, we recommend creating local guidance on the specific rights and recommendations for the care of seriously ill patients in your jurisdiction who transfer from prisons to community hospitals. This is an example of a document that we developed with the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation here. We distribute it throughout California hospitals for community healthcare professionals and to community ethics boards. And it's available online. You're welcome to use it as a template if it's helpful. And finally, 6, this is the last lesson. It's by far the most important lesson. It should be the first lesson. It's to partner with residents and their loved ones to identify meaningful solutions. The COVID-19 pandemic has been a terrifying time for all of us. It's especially terrifying for incarcerated patients and their loved ones. They've had very important ideas and recommendations about how to build trust and partner together with residents and staff alike, to fortify facilities, to minimize the risk of transmission. Failure to engage residents and their families as thought partners in this problem is basically leaving out over half of the important solutions. Just basically leaving them on the table. And so I'll just close with a quote from the Department of Corrections Director from North Dakota, who recently said, "Why is a more humanistic approach to corrections important even now during a pandemic?" And she said, "Because North Dakota's prison residents are the Department of Corrections partners in the effort to keep our facilities safe. And they're doing extra cleaning, maintaining social distancing as much as possible in a congregate housing situation, and sharing their ideas on how to maintain a calm environment. As a result, in a time of crisis when there's heightened fear among us all, North Dakota's prison staff continue to receive letters of appreciation from residents thanking them for keeping them well informed and being caring and patient during a very stressful time." So I wish you all good health and good luck, and thanks for your attention. I hope you learned something from our mistakes here in the US.
Thanks so much, Bree. I absolutely learned a lot from that, and was really saddened actually to see some of those images and hear some of those stories. And Stephen Caruana raised the issue that we have similar problems in Australia with mandatory quarantine when you're taken to a prison, and we might address that in the questions. But next we have Adnan Khan, whose story was actually a huge source of hope and strength, and I'm really, you know, it's an honor to introduce you, Adnan. You're, as your bio states, the executive director and co-founder of Restore Justice, and Adnan co-founded this organisation while he was incarcerated. So Adnan was sentenced to 25 years to life under the felony murder rule at the age of 18. While in prison, he inspired, launched and worked on the felony murder rule legislation with his organisation, Restore Justice. The bill passed, and after serving 16 years, in January 2019, Adnan was the first person resentenced under the bill. He wrote in his application for his sentence to be commuted that if given the opportunity to re-enter society, I will live a life of service with the purpose of preventing and deterring crime and increasing public safety for our communities. And absolutely, it sounds like you're living that life, Adnan. And hence his sentence was commuted. He's gone on to do many amazing things, including during his incarceration, he created First Watch, a media filmmaking project produced entirely by incarcerated men at San Quentin State Prison. And this continues to produce short films today. He does many other initiatives, and I'll now just hand it over to him to hear your perspectives, Adnan, on the situation now under COVID. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you everyone for having me and allowing me to participate in this very important international conversation of public safety and public health. So thank you for having me. I don't have any fancy slides. I kind of regret that now after seeing all of your slides and how informative and easy to read they were. But that was also somewhat intentional for me. As a person who's incarcerated, communication is so key with correctional staff, with medical staff, mental health staff, that there aren't papers involved. So forgive me for not having it, but also know that it was somewhat intentional to just communicate a few things. One thing I want to center my talk around is value. And after all, we are talking about human beings. We're talking about people interacting with other people, whether you wear a badge or you don't, or a medical degree on your wall. Regardless of all of that, the qualifications, we're talking about interactions with people. And so for me, you heard my intro. I did start Restore Justice, my organization, while incarcerated. But before I was a traumatized, parentless, homeless high school dropout. That is the quote unquote product that the prison system received. So the product that the jail and the prison system received of who I am, Adnan Khan, was again a traumatized, parentless, homeless high school dropout. And that is actually either one, during trial, it was used against me. Oh, you were traumatized, you weren't, that you're a threat to society. You were parentless, that you're a wild child. You are homeless, that you will do anything to, and therefore you are a threat to public safety. You are a high school dropout, and therefore you don't have a cognitive ability to make decisions or keep yourself or society safe. All of it is false. Those are just situations, circumstances that I was, that led into my incarceration. So coming into the prison system, being sentenced to life and then being sent to a maximum security prison, the value of an incarcerated person is consistently shown. It's shown through deprivation of family and love. It's shown through deprivation or a controlling of the temperature in a cell. Hot days, it's hot, cold days, it's cold. It's shown through lack of food or limited food, lack of nutrition. So many different ways, sensory deprivation. I was in a cell for 5 years where all I saw was a concrete wall. All of those things are added into the mental, physical, spiritual, person. When I experienced my first, well, not my first, I want to talk about how one of the sickest I've ever been. I've had the worst sickness in not just my entire 16 years of my incarceration. It was the year 2015. This is the sickest I've ever been in my entire life. And until this day, I don't know what the virus was or how I had contracted the virus, because I never checked into medical. So seeing how correctional culture works, how there is a distrust towards correction staff and towards medical staff, that I did not want to check into the medical department because I did not trust how they would take care of me. Prisons, I know, are not hospitable. They're not hospitals. Therefore, they're not hospitable. So I don't trust the care that will come with me checking into medical. So it is also widely understood that between incarcerated people, that if you check into medical, and actually the phrase that we used to use is, don't turn yourself in. Don't turn yourself into the authorities. And authorities, I mean medical. So it's widely understood that amongst incarcerated people, that if you check into medical for any serious virus or serious illness, that you'll be sent to what we consider solitary confinement and be isolated. And like Bree was just talking about, it's not medical isolation, it is solitary confinement. And it is common knowledge that sickness in prison is punishable. So who would want to be further punished? You're already sick. And who would want to be further punished by being sent to solitary confinement where your amenities like your property, your stamps, your pen or pencil and your tablet, your family's pictures and letters will be taken away from you? Nobody wants that. So I chose to take care of myself. I believe that I could do a better job than the prison's punitive response to sickness and its already substandard healthcare system. So I stayed in my cell. I lay on my bunk for several days, almost 3 days. I remember I was shivering relentlessly. I had severe hot and cold flashes. I couldn't move an inch to the right or left without severe or excruciating pain. I couldn't eat, for one, because I didn't have an appetite, but two, the prison food, like I just talked about, it just tastes horrible, but I personally did not trust its nutritional value. The old or rotten apples and bananas that we would get, the soggy lettuce, I just did not trust it. So all I did was drink water from a sink in my cell and rest. So I barely slept. When I did sleep, I had nightmares because of my physical and my conditional circumstances. Many of the nightmares I remember were about my family. I'd wake up with intense worry. I just worried, like, what are they up to? Do they know about me? Are they sick? Just, those nightmares, those negative, fearful thoughts that came to my mind during my sickness. So as my physical pain evolved with the virus that I had contracted, my emotional and mental health also, my emotional and mental pain also grew substantially. Like I mentioned, since prisons aren't hospitals, they lack hospitality. And in times of sickness, we all know that all human beings, again, human beings need, yes, physical well-being, physical comfort, but also during sickness, emotional comfort is very important. Physical and mental trigger one another. And so, like, to receive a nice blanket and someone is going to bring me soup, like, those things do matter and have mattered, at least when I was a child and my parents were around, mattered and helped me nurse myself back to health. But that does not exist in prison. Punishment does. So turning myself in and notifying medical staff was not a desired option for those reasons. Going to solitary can mean, like I said, losing your cellmate, losing the cell location that you have. In my opinion, in my 16 years of experience, having a compatible cellmate was probably 90% of my mental health, doing time in a positive mental health way. So having a compatible cellmate and losing that can really add to more trauma. Being put in a cell with someone else, once you return from this not medical isolation, but solitary confinement, can be compounded problems afterwards. You also don't have phone calls or contact with your family. Another thing is, when you do, like Bree was talking about, medical isolation, solitary confinement are two different things. When you do get sent to solitary confinement, doesn't matter what you're there for. You could be there for medical reasons, or you could be there for punitive reasons. Either way, once you enter that building, the rules and regulations are not modified to your needs. You will be treated as if you are in solitary confinement, and whatever those rules apply in that unit, they will apply to you. So Once you're in solitary, you will abide by and you will be treated by such regulations. And that is the culture, a punitive culture of prisons. But there's also this relationship that people have been treated and view medical staff the same as correction staff, because we have not seen or experienced a separation of two, or there to be its own independent, isolated care services, without correctional staff being present. One thing I do want to bring up is about my friend recently. I was released last year in January of 2019. Unfortunately, one of my good years in San Quentin. I was released in 2019. It was after spending 4.5 years there. And one of my friends, his name is Eric. During this COVID outbreak, after this botched transfer that Bree was telling you about, my friend Eric tested positive for COVID on 6/25 this year. A month later, literally on 7/25, he died of COVID. After he tested negative, 10 days later, immediately afterwards, he was mixed with positive cases in San Quentin. 10 days later, he checked into medical with symptoms. And 3 weeks after that, exactly a month after he tested negative, he died of COVID. And that really, I'm still grieving from my friend. Now, maybe staff, the way the system was set up, didn't view my friend as worthy of receiving proper care, or the COVID procedures in the facility weren't taken seriously, or were administered not through medical, but through corrections, for whatever reason. But I do know that he was not treated as a patient. He was treated as an inmate, as a convict, as a prisoner. And when I said earlier, I want to center my conversation around value of human beings and value of people. We talk about the worth that we put on people. And when we put a worth on somebody, it's much easier to distribute treatment based on that worth. One of the things in my advocacy, in our work that we do here, we work on language. It may seem very small, minute, not a big deal, but language is very important in my advocacy. I don't use the term inmate. I don't use the term convict. I don't use the term prisoner. Prisoner was written over my pants and on my shirt for 16 years. So just the sight of that term is repulsive to me personally. But when we use language for people, those are words, at least for me, I associate certain treatment towards that. Language is used to dehumanize people. And so he wasn't seen as a patient. When I came into the prison system as this traumatized, parentless, homeless, high school dropout, I wasn't treated as a patient. I wasn't treated as a student. I wasn't treated as a person who needs housing. I was treated as a dangerous criminal, convict, inmate. And I think when we treat people the way we want to be treated, I think the care and the social services around that make it much, much more easier to administer. And we've heard earlier, about what are some of the solutions to reentry or depopulation or decarceration. And I think that we fall under a problem of putting a Band-Aid on a problem versus doing surgery. And I think surgery is equivalent of abolition. And I think that is why, let's just house somebody. Let's just decarcerate and house somebody. But the truth is that there are needs that aren't being met. A physical structure is one thing, but the needs that come after that, the mental health needs, the financial needs, the food stipends, all go together in a social structure, whether it's done through reallocating funding, whether it's done through private funding, however that's done. I believe that is the source of creating this more humane society and therefore humane treatment. Lastly, I'll say that circling back to the idea of the trust with incarcerated people, medical staff, and correction staff. Who is making the decisions and who trumps these decisions, right? Does medical have full authority without any consequences over a patient. A lot of times, I know that if I, as a person who's serving a life sentence, and my freedom had depended on me potentially eventually going to a parole board, and if they see in my file that, hey, you know what, this gentleman or this person has seen mental health services or medical services, they will inquire about that. And many times that can be stigmatized. Mental health, medical services can be stigmatized and can be jeopardize your freedom. And those are other reasons why when corrections and medical combine together, and there's no separation of one or the other. And so in closing, I just want to, maybe open up for questions, but I do want to share that reducing the prison population becomes hard because we only look at it as a Band-Aid. And the reason we have a mass incarceration problem, the reason we have a COVID in prison problem, in my opinion, in the United States, is because we have a mass incarceration problem. There's too many people in prison. There's approximately 2.3 million people in United States prison and jail. But another shocking statistic about jails is, and I learned from the Prison Policy Initiative, is that the jail turnover rate, that people going to jail are 10.6 million per year. So 10.6 million times you could see that revolving door of people coming in and out of these facilities. So we can look at mass incarceration and COVID together as, hey, there's too many people coming to prison or in prison. But the truth is, when we look at surgery and just take a step back, that mass incarceration is linked to, in America, systemic oppression, systemic slavery. If you look at the concept of convict leasing immediately after the slavery was quote unquote abolished, where the 13th Amendment literally says that slavery is actually legal for those who are incarcerated. A lot of people view the 13th Amendment of the United States as slavery is abolished. Yes, but what it also says that gets kind of hidden is slavery is in the amendment is actually legal if you are incarcerated. And so there is a systemic problem that we do have. It goes from there to policing, to labor. Now I'm in prison because there's many people in prison. So I kind of stopped there. I can go on a little bit longer, but hopefully without my slides, this made somewhat sense. But I'm open for any questions, and thank you for giving me this time and this opportunity to present the human part of incarceration. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Adnan. And I'm really sorry to hear about your friend. That's very painful for you, but for all of us to hear the devastation, in the pandemic and more broadly. And you make a really essential point that many of the practices that oppress people in prisons are not just inflicted by correctional staff, but very much work in tandem with health professionals in prison. We have, I noticed in the audience, George Newhouse, who runs the National Justice Project, and his work is actually dedicated to looking at the layers of discrimination and trauma created by health professionals in their practices. So I think we need to understand that these systems are very expansive and not limited to certain silos. And thank you also for just your insights into the humanitarian and humane aspects of the prison experience, and breaking down, I think, many assumptions that there's a difference between people inside and outside. I think we should all be realistic that in a society that imprisons, none of us are immune. There's all types of things that imprison people that are subjectively criminal, and we've seen certainly in Australia with Black Lives Matter and other types of activism that the criminal justice system has targeted many people who are committed to causes of humanitarianism. So finally, we have Dr. Homer Venters, who's a clinical associate professor at New York University College of Global Public Health. He's a leading expert in the field of medicine, epidemiology, and his work aims to bridge health systems, surveillance, and justice. He also has a fantastic but sobering TED-Med talk that came out this year and is entitled Exposing the Deadly Health Risks of Incarceration. We'll include a link to this talk in the notes, and I welcome Homer.
Thank you, Thalia. You all can hear me. I hope you'll jump in if you can. Great. So I have some slides that I'll go through. Thank you to the other panelists, to the moderators, to the OPCAT network, everybody who put this great group together. I've learned a lot, so thank you. And thanks for the questions that are coming up on chat also. So I have some slides that will show up at any moment, but there we go. It's just about to, but my name's great. My name's Homer Venters. My background is I was the chief medical officer of the New York City jail system, which is one of the larger jail systems in the United States. And for the folks outside the United States, it also happens to be one of the very few detention systems in our country that has an independent health service. And so to this really critical issue of dual loyalty and the failure of correctional health services to really meet the needs of patients, but instead to serve as minions, really, or feel the pressure, the crushing weight of dual loyalty by the security environment. It's something that I really have, struggled with a lot and thought a lot about having, but I had the benefit of working in an independent setting. Back in April, I left, I had a role leading a correctional health nonprofit where I went after I left the New York City jails. But I guess by February or March, it was clear to, most people in this world that COVID was going to pose a disaster for people who are detained in jails and prisons in our country. And so since April, all I have done is work on COVID investigations inside jails, prisons, and immigration detention centers in the United States. And so I'll just talk a little bit about that. We can go to the next slide. So I'll talk a little bit about, I already have my perspective investigating COVID-19 in detention settings. Talk a little bit about what I mean, what are the elements that I think are essential in these COVID-19 assessments of detention settings, and then some common findings and recommendations. I think we've already heard some great ideas, so I won't spend too much time on replicating what we've heard. We can go to the next slide. So these are some of the states in the United States where I've been involved in investigating COVID-19 outbreaks behind bars. Looking at this, I realize there's a couple states missing, but it's basically all I've done since April, and it's taken me, except for the California, everywhere else I've driven to, so I've put a lot of miles on my car. But the types of facilities that I have been investigating or inspecting or addressing COVID-19 response in include federal prisons, state prisons, county jails, and also immigration detention centers, which is another, I think it's something we share with Australia, this kind of mirror image or replicated set of detention settings that bear some similarities, have some differences administratively, but they're really critical for COVID concerns. We can go to the next slide. So these three questions I use to frame every investigation I conduct. So maybe 40 of these so far, I haven't counted, but these are for me, these questions are very related to each other, but they help me parse out whether or not the facility is doing what it should and can do to protect the lives of people. So the first one is, do they adequately find and respond to individual cases of COVID-19? Things like adequate screening to find new cases, or what are they doing when they find a case? Are they putting them in solitary? Do they have medical isolation? What's their sense of quarantine? Things like that. The second question, does the facility adequately prevent or slow the spread of COVID-19? So this bucket includes a lot of standard infection control things we think about, like hand washing, paper towels, social distancing, wearing of masks, things like that. Transfers in between facilities, all of that. The third area is, does the facility find and protect high-risk patients? And because at the end of the day, in many, some of the the settings where I've done inspections, 80 or 90% of people had COVID. COVID runs very quickly through these settings. And many of our efforts should be and can be focused on preventing loss of life. Kind of the same frame I had when I was leading the health service in the New York City jails was to really think first about morbidity and mortality. There's a lot of work to do in a health service behind bars, but really a very useful frame is, does what we're doing help prevent the likelihood that somebody will die? And so in this case, with the COVID response, having a discrete bucket about high-risk patients, because we generally know who they are, and figuring out how can we keep them from dying and keep them from becoming very, very ill. So these are the three buckets I use when I conduct an investigation. We can go to the next. So this is just a very brief look at what kind of benchmarks do I use and others use when they're conducting these types of assessments. You know, it's difficult. First of all, I should say we don't have the OPCAT framework here, which is really an incredible limitation. So most detention settings in the United States, most jails, most prisons, most immigration detention settings, never have unannounced outside expert inspections. And that is incredibly poor. It's just a real deficiency in our national strategy. It also means that we leave jailers to make critical decisions about health and health care. And not just about health care in process, but also about transparency and accountability. So, you know, the benchmarks in the COVID response investigations, the CDC has put out and has updated multiple times some guidelines about detention settings and health, which have been helpful in some of this. They're certainly the only set of, you know, very clearly defined guidelines that, you know, when I'm reporting to judges and other like leadership or in litigation, they're critical guidelines, but they don't cover everything that we think, you know, and we've been talking about here is important. There are other correctional health guidelines, and it's important to note that many of the reasons people die from COVID preventably aren't COVID specific. They're about weaknesses or failures in healthcare behind bars that pre-exist COVID and will be there afterwards unless we fix them. And then there are community standards. And so the framework for these assessments, you know, sometimes I'm hired by people who, you know, groups that are bringing litigation like the American Civil Liberties Union or the Southern Poverty Law Center. Sometimes I've been retained by court, so a judge may on their own in the midst of litigation say they need a medical expert to do an independent assessment. Some states also have taken the very important step of creating a COVID oversight panel. So like in Connecticut, there's a few of us that are on a panel that have a state mandate to oversee the COVID response in the state prison system. So there are lots, because we don't have one structure for oversight and monitoring of health and healthcare behind bars in this country, there are all sorts of ways in which both you might end up having somebody come in and do a COVID assessment. There are also myriad ways that the facilities will object to that ever happening. And I would say more often than not, they're successful in those objections. We can go on to the next slide. So I think that I'd just like to talk about what I think are some of the important elements of doing, at least for me, doing an assessment of a facility. If I'm thinking about I'm going to be making a swing across the South in the next couple of weeks and going to prisons in several southern states and jails. And I think that obviously physical inspection is critical. You need to be able to see and with your own eyes, not with a video remote inspection, you know, what's happening, understand the layout and how different parts of the facility connect or don't connect. I would say the most important element for me is being able to speak with detained people and staff. But since April, I've probably talked to, I don't know, a couple hundred detained people who have taught me and informed my ideas about what they're personally experiencing and what the pace of the outbreak has been like inside detention settings. I think that without this element, Many of the inspections or reports I've heard about involve simply walking through the facility with the staff and looking at some administrative records. And what you come away with there is what I would call a numerator report. That is to say, you come away with an impressive list of all the stuff that's been done, because that's what the staff would show you, right? They would take you to all the places where they've made changes. They would show you everything they have done. What speaking with detained people gets me is the denominator, which is what needed to be done. And this is the thing that is quintessentially lacking, at least in the United States, in correctional health. Because our healthcare in prisons and jails is cut away from the rest of the country's approach to quality, accountability. What it means is that jailers, medical staff who work in these settings can always list off all the many, many things they've done. And when it comes to COVID, every place has done quite a bit of stuff. You know, they've put pieces of tape all over the floor. They've handed out zillions of masks. They've ordered lots of PPE. They may even have done a lot of tests. But the perspective of detained people is essential to understanding what did they need to have done? What was the scope of need? And without that, I find these assessments to be much less valuable. We can go on to the next slide. So I'll try not to replicate too much what the others have said. I think that I'll just go through each of these three big bucket questions that I use and highlight one or two findings that I find in many of the places I go. Limited screening. So many places will do what they call daily screenings, but they may only check temperatures for everybody in the facility. And this is a real deficiency because those non-contact infrared thermometers that are being used are very inaccurate. And many people don't have an elevated temperature on the first, second, or third day, or they may not at all, but they may have COVID. And so because it takes more staff and more time to affirmatively ask about symptoms, which is what should be done, screenings that rely just on temperature are deficient. Broken sick call and chronic care is also something that I find quite a bit. I think that this is really, something that I think we might have heard a little bit about, but besides active surveillance or screening, the way that most people who are sick come to the attention of medical staff is through what in the States we call sick call, which is a medical request or a request for medical care. Most places will tell you or say that we have a policy to respond to every sick call request, whether it's electronic or paper, and we do that in a day or 2 days. What I find most often by speaking with detained people is that that's not how it really works. And when I review sick call requests or ask for them, I find the same thing. And chronic care is also an area where there is really, a very deficient approach to medical care. And then I think Bree did a great job of talking about the issue of solitary confinement is, instead of or in place of medical isolation. We can go to the next slide. So this middle bucket, I think, is something that we've probably heard a lot about. I think the contact tracing, it's strangely almost absent in these places. So when there's a case in a facility, they may just, the limit of contact tracing may just be to say everybody in this housing area is considered a cohort, or they're going to be quarantined because they're the people, if they've been in this housing area with the same person for 72 hours, that's how we're going to decide that they're close contacts. But people, even in these times of COVID, people move. If they go to medical clinic, they may be in a waiting room with people. If they go to the intake or in transportation. So contact tracing is really critical, but it's very lacking in these settings. Hand washing, social distancing, and mask wearing also are notoriously deficient. People don't have anything to dry their hands with usually. They don't have paper towels, even if they can find a faucet. And mask wearing, one of the things that is most consistent in the places I've been is that there are loads and loads of officers that don't wear their masks. So people may get masks given out to them, but what they see in front of them is that there are many officers that don't wear their masks. and the lack of engagement with the correctional staff as really critical components of infection control is quite ubiquitous. And the third one, I think, speaks for itself. It's just people move around all the time. And if we don't include thinking about how people move to do their work, not just the detained people in terms of their housing, we miss opportunities for infection control. We can go to the next one. So here, I think that, if we want to protect high-risk patients, the first thing we need to do is get them out. We need to find them, but we generally know who they are in most jails and prisons and ICE detention. And one of the big wins we've had in the immigration detention setting is this class action suit called Freyhat. ICE has now been forced to go through and identify who is in this high-risk cohort, and they're going through a process of considering them for release. And so this is where the release is beneficial for many reasons, as Bree said, but certainly release is the first step in protecting high-risk people. And the other thing I'll say about that is we have now people all over jails and prisons and ICE detention settings that have a label of recovered because they have, there has been mass testing in more places. People have a positive test. They don't have symptoms at the time they're tested, and they get this label of recovered. Many of those people still have actually quite serious symptoms. Actually, as a correctional officer that taught me the most about this, he said, I'm a long hauler. I'm 90 days out from my infection. I still can't get up in the morning. I still have ringing in my ears. I still have headaches. Many people in jails and prisons and ICE detention have these persistent symptoms, and they're not documented at all. And so as they go home, or as they face the flu season, or even a recurrence or a new infection of COVID-19, this new level of morbidity that's with them is not being tracked or addressed. We can go to the next slide. So these are pretty common recommendations. Some of these can be done pretty quickly, and some of them are almost impossible to do in our detention setting. So, county jails in the US have been, some of them, quite effective at release. When I inspected Cook County, which is Chicago, and Shelby County, which is Memphis, they really had reduced their census quite a bit. Prisons have been very slow to do this for a lot of reasons that I think you probably can understand. Expanding testing is happening more. The broken sick call and chronic care, I think this reflects a weakness that predates COVID in these settings. And it exists because we allow it to exist, because we say it's okay for people who are incarcerated to have their health care determined by people who aren't experts in health care. And that's not changing quickly. And the last bullet there, use COVID-19 to expand transparency. My hope is that because we have this fleeting interest of local and state departments of health, of the CDC, organizations that really up to now have been completely AWOL when it comes to the health and wellness of people who are incarcerated, everywhere we have to figure out how to grab the arms of these people and hold on to them and not let them leave. Because I think that keeping these people involved and these organizations involved, like the CDC, like state departments of health, isn't just important for this pandemic or the next infection or even any specific health problem. It's that we can't really undo mass incarceration in our country unless we get more champions to understand how harmful it is. And so if the people that are responsible for health, like the CDC, are forced, we really rub their noses in how harmful incarceration is, I think that brings hopefully new voices. This last tidbit that I mentioned in the TED Talk is, the CDC spends millions of dollars in the United States every year to find and prevent traumatic brain injury in youth sports. I don't know how many millions, but it's millions. They don't spend a single cent to do the same thing behind bars. Even though, like when I was at Rikers, we published several papers on the alarming incidents of traumatic brain injury among our patients in jail. But you wouldn't know that it ever happens once if you look at the CDC website or State Department of Health. So we have to figure out how to leverage this time, not just to improve the outlook of COVID response behind bars and promote release, to keep these evidence-based institutions inside the wall. I think that might be my last slide. It is. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Homer. Someone made the response how individual and insightful this talk has been, and that's an excellent note to finish the presentations on. I'm just going to now build a couple of questions. The first one was from Stephen Caruana, and it referred to the fact that guidelines have supported routine intake quarantine for new arrivals to prison. And he asked, from a medical perspective, how can we respond to the proportionate response to risk that, you know, that obviously is required to protect people, but at the same time not encroach on the human rights of those who are arriving at prison?
This is a really hard question. You know, I think we have to fall back. Well, you absolutely always have to fall back on do no harm. The question is, what is the greater harm? To take away somebody's basically human rights for 14 days, or to potentially house them with somebody who can give them a life-threatening disease for 14 days. So what do you do on either side of that equation to change that basic comparison? So what can you do to the quarantine unit to make it less of an infringement on human rights? I think that that's where you start. So in terms of 14 days, I mean, there's a few different solutions being discussed, and I'd be curious to hear what others in Canada are doing, what Homer thinks. There's a lot of discussion about, for example, if people are coming in, and well, the first thing is don't bring more people into congregate living facilities than need to be there. Absolutely. So the number of admissions should be decreasing drastically, and in many states and nations it is. For the people who are coming in, for example, from jails, people may come in having been housed together in jails, and they may come into a facility together through transport together. Those people you can think of as a cohort and house them together. There are some people who are being isolated for 14 days in the jail prior to admission into the prison. They get tested on day 2, they get tested on day 13, they travel on day 14. When they come into the prison, depending on what type of testing they've had, whether it's been, you know, PCR and antigen, et cetera, like you have to get into more of the specifics of the testing regimen, but you can potentially have a slightly shorter window of time. But, you know, I think it's really tough. I mean, we saw what happened at San Quentin when 120 people who had not had recent testing, most of them had not had recent testing. That is true. But 120 people were moved into a prison with open bar doors. And now we have 26 people who are dead and scores of people hospitalized, and, you know, nearly the entire population testing positive or refusing testing and probably positive. So I cannot, you know, I think that the money should be on making the quarantine experience less of a human rights infraction, with a lot more incentives built in, and a lot more, I mean, give everybody a cell phone, my goodness, enough already. You know, give everybody a Padlet to talk to their families. I don't know, it just seems to me that that's where the money should be, and not on deciding whether or not to put people into shared housing too soon and risking the lives and the health of scores of people.
Thanks so much, Bree. I've got quite a few questions for Adnan, so I might just shoot a few through to you, and some of them are overlapping. So from Stephen and Emad Talisman, they're asking you to comment on whether independent oversight agencies would make a difference. So would it make people more open to speaking about healthcare, and how these accountability mechanisms can be strengthened? Also, I'd just be really interested to know whether there are any actions or resistance by people inside at the moment in the face of the COVID response. So something quite different, but I'll give you a few minutes to respond, and I think we might need to wrap up after that.
Yeah, I think the oversight, there's two things that we're talking about. I think one, the question, how it was framed, at least how I'm understanding it, is the oversight to develop trust to let you know my medical conditions, so on and so forth. So it's more of a conversation we're talking about. But the next phase is the distribution of those procedures, and who's executing those procedures. Similar to what Bree was talking about with the botched transfer to San Quentin, correctional officers do the handcuffing, putting you on the bus, driving you to the other prison, handing you over to other correctional officers, transporting. I mean, that procedure is taken out through correctional staff. And that's where I've seen the mix up. So sure, I can speak to an oversight committee about my health conditions, my mental health fears perhaps, and feel safe doing so. But I'm being put right back into an environment in the literal care of correctional staff with the culture that I already live under. And that's where my opinion, the breakdown is. Hopefully I answered that question properly. I'm willing to take another question if there is a follow-up to that. But to yours, your question, Tyler, you're talking about as far as the pushback from incarcerated people in terms of COVID right now. Yeah. So yes, absolutely. There have been people, and so in San Quentin right now, they have had over, like Bree was mentioning, over a 50% infectious rate. But that is recorded. There are a lot of people I still talk to. Like I said, I did 4 years there. I talked to maybe 2 to 3 dozen people since I've been out, just from San Quentin alone. And many of my friends are refusing to test, because what's happening is that what they ended up doing a few months ago was they created tents on the yard. They were sending people to solitary confinement, and particularly in an area where it's called a reception center, where new people come from county jail, waiting to not go to the main line of San Quentin, but to be housed in a segregated area and then to be transferred to 34 other prisons in California. But that area, well, where I was housed at, I have electricity in my cell. It's a 4-foot by 9-foot cell, tiny, with another person. But I do have electricity. I have a TV that my family has bought me. I have food. I have a hot pot that could warm up water and have warm coffee and warm soup. But in this area called Badger Section in San Quentin, there's no electricity. There's no plugs. It's for newer arrivals. And mainline people were sent there. So people are afraid to go there. I don't want to go there. I rather, if I'm going to be sick, I'm going to stay right here. Not only that, they created one of the factory workers, the factory area, which they make furniture. They converted that area and put 220 cots there. And the air conditioning, I mean, they just didn't want to go to the tents, to the cots in the furniture factory. People didn't want to go to the Badger Section, the reception center. People don't want to do that. And they've seen that if you do test positive, not just do you get moved, you're not necessarily being taken care of. And so people have been refusing tests. And also threat to be transferred. That's another thing. Away from family. And so there's been major pushback. There's we hear about correctional officers not wearing masks. Correctional officers, mind you, are still searching cells. And you don't have the cleaning supplies to clean your cell after 3 or 4 correction officers stepped into your 4 feet by 9 feet cell. And so there's many reasons why there's pushback, and understandable pushback.
Thank you so much, Adnan. I'm just going to make a comment on Imad's behalf. He just says that there are risks associated with labels from assessments. So terms like high risk, psychopathic, sex offender, high needs, suicide watch, etc. And this is kind of inherent in some of the tools that are used and some of the knowledges and epistemologies of their health profession and practice. And he does ask Homer, we won't have time for a response about how to minimize this, but I think this is one of the challenges. How do we humanize the experience rather than stereotype it and lead to more punitive responses? And then there's a final question from Maddie around what the state or the status of the OPCAT discussion is at the moment. in the US and whether there's been any developments or traction. I'm not sure if anyone wants to quickly respond to that.
Homer, that has you written all over it. Earth to Homer.
Thanks. So I'll just say that it's pretty beleaguered. You know, even every time a state even tries to increase a little bit the transparency around death reporting, the most like serious outcome, there's vehement objection from, you know, correctional officers unions, all the regular lobbies you would assume. So we don't have a clear and proximate path to OPCAT in this country. It's not even a legislative priority. And so it's pretty far away. I think there are states that have made efforts like New York and California, as you would predict. But it's pretty bleak right now. And I'll just finish with the high risk term I meant is solely a health risk, although obviously health labels can be very stigmatizing. And it's a real problem actually in our discussions because you know, I make recommendations for release based on the likelihood that somebody will die. But other people look at a detained person and have a different idea of what the risks are and who the risks accrue to. So it's really central to the struggle we're having.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's been a real honor to chair this session, and I hope we can keep in touch. I know that myself, Stephen, and others in the audience here from Australia have looked towards what's happening in the United States and in Canada, and look towards your lobbying, your advocacy, and your support work with people inside. And we'll continue to keep in touch and hopefully draw on our collaboration. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for staying up late, and looking forward to many more discussions. Bye.